The room started spinning while I was making coffee, and I had to sit down on my kitchen floor before I collapsed completely. My daughter-in-law took one look at me having a dizzy spell and immediately dropped to the floor like she'd been shot, clutching her chest and gasping about sudden chest pains. 20 minutes later, I was helping myself into Richard's car while the paramedics fussed over her Academy Award performance. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. What I didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just about stealing attention. There was something much darker happening in my own home. Now, let me paint you a picture of my life. I'm Martha Calloway, 74 years old, and blessed with a daughter-in-law who apparently thinks medical emergencies are a competitive sport. This particular Tuesday started innocently enough. I was minding my own business, making my morning coffee like a responsible adult, when the universe decided to throw me a curveball. I was reaching for my favorite mug when the kitchen suddenly started spinning faster than a politician's promises during election season. My head felt like it was floating 3 feet above my shoulders, and my legs turned into overcooked spaghetti. Being the genius I am, I decided to sit down on my kitchen floor before I face-planted into my coffee maker. There I was, 74 years old, sitting cross-legged on my own linoleum, staring up at the ceiling and wondering what the hell was happening to me. "Richard!" I called out, trying to sound casual despite the circumstances. "I need some help here. Your girlfriend just made friends with the kitchen floor." My partner of 15 years came running like the house was on fire. He took one look at me sitting on the floor, and his face went white as my good china. "Martha, what happened? Are you hurt?" I got dizzy and had to sit down. "The room won't stop spinning. How long have you been sitting there?" "Long enough to contemplate my life choices and count the dust bunnies under the refrigerator. Apparently my housekeeping skills need work." Richard was reaching for his phone when the back door burst open. Vanessa appeared like she had radar for family emergencies, which, come to think of it, she probably did. "I came to borrow some sugar." "Oh my God!" She stopped dead, stared at me on the floor for exactly 2 seconds, then pressed both hands to her chest like she was pledging allegiance. "I can't breathe," she gasped, swaying dramatically. "Something's wrong. My chest, the pressure," and down she went. Right there on my kitchen floor, writhing around like she was being exorcised. I sat there, still dizzy, watching this performance and thinking, well, this is interesting timing. "Call 911, Richard shouted, abandoning me to rush to Princess Drama Queen. "Already on it." Thomas appeared from somewhere, from phone glued to his ear. "We need an ambulance." 1 ambulance. For 2 emergencies. Guess which one got priority? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't the person who was actually sick. The paramedics arrived faster than pizza delivery, took one look at Vanessa's theatrical writhing, and immediately swarmed her like she was the only patient in a 50-mile radius. Meanwhile, I sat on my kitchen floor, still dizzy, watching this circus unfold. "Ma'am, we need to get you to the hospital immediately," they told Vanessa, loading her onto a stretcher. "What about my mother?" Thomas asked, gesturing vaguely in my direction like I was a forgotten grocery bag. "Can she walk to the car? Can she walk to the car?" Like I was the afterthought in my own medical emergency, which technically I was. "I think I can manage," I replied, accepting Richard's help to stand up. The dizziness was fading, but something else was just beginning to take shape in my mind. 20 minutes later, we were at Mercy Hospital, where Vanessa had managed to claim 3 nurses, 2 doctors, and the complete attention of my entire family. There she was in exam room 3, describing her life-threatening symptoms, while Thomas and Richard hung on her every word. And me? I sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, no longer dizzy, but definitely starting to see a pattern that made my blood run colder than the hospital air conditioning. "Mrs. Calloway?" a young resident finally called out, looking like he'd been working since the Clinton administration. "Sorry for the wait. Your daughter-in-law's cardiac episode seemed more urgent." "Of course it did," I replied, following him to an exam room. Funny how these things happen. As he checked my blood pressure and asked about my dizzy spell, I could hear Vanessa's voice from the next room, still describing her symptoms in vivid detail like she was narrating her own medical drama. But here's what struck me. When the doctor finally told her that all her tests were normal and she could go home, her recovery was nothing short of miraculous. 1 minute she was knocking on death's door, the next minute she was walking out under her own power, laughing about how stress must have triggered her episode. Stress. The stress of having to share medical attention, apparently. "Your blood pressure is slightly elevated," the resident said, "but that could be from the stress of the episode." "How often do you have dizzy spells like this?" "More often lately," I admitted. maybe once or twice a week. Any other symptoms? Nausea, fatigue, changes in appetite? Now that he mentioned it, yes. I'd been feeling more tired lately, having bouts of nausea that came and went like uninvited guests. I'd chalked it all up to getting older, but sitting there in that sterile exam room, I started to wonder. Some nausea, yes, and I've been more tired than usual. At your age, these symptoms could indicate several things. I'd recommend following up with your primary care physician for a more thorough workup. That night, I sat in my favorite chair, no longer dizzy, but definitely thinking, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was a pattern here that I'd been too polite or too trusting to acknowledge. 3 months ago, when I'd fallen down the stairs and hit my head, Vanessa had suddenly developed breathing problems that required oxygen and an EKG. The EMTs had spent more time treating her panic attack than checking me for a concussion. 6 months ago, when I'd had that car accident and needed stitches for the cut on my forehead, Vanessa had fainted at the scene and claimed the first ambulance while I waited in the rain with blood dripping into my eyes. And last year, during my gallbladder surgery, Vanessa had such a severe panic attack in the waiting room that they'd had to call a separate medical team to treat her while I was on the operating table. Every single time I'd needed medical attention, Vanessa had managed to upstage me with her own emergency. It was like having a medical understudy who kept pushing the star off the stage. I pulled out a notebook and started writing down every incident I could remember. The more I documented, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just coincidence. It was systematic. But why? What did Vanessa gain by stealing medical attention from her mother-in-law? Was it just narcissism, or was there something more deliberate happening here? I thought about the way Richard had looked when the paramedics were treating Vanessa instead of me. Not worried or confused, but almost relieved. And I thought about how quickly Vanessa had appeared in my kitchen that morning. I hadn't called her. Thomas hadn't called her. She'd just shown up, right as I was having my dizzy spell, like she'd been expecting it, like she'd been waiting for it. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I started keeping a detailed medical journal, not the Dear Diary kind, but a proper log. Times, symptoms, circumstances, who was present, how long episodes lasted, and most importantly, Vanessa's reactions to each incident. I also started making phone calls. First, I called my old friend Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd spent 30 years dealing with every variety of patient known to medical science. Sarah, hypothetical question. If someone consistently had medical emergencies, but only when someone else needed help, what would you call that? Attention-seeking behavior, factitious disorder, or remarkably convenient timing, she replied. Why are you asking? Please tell me you're not diagnosing family members again. Just curious about human psychology and the fascinating ways people compete for sympathy. Martha, you're being evasive. What's really going on? I told her about yesterday's incident and the pattern I was starting to see. Sarah listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. How many times has this happened? She asked when I finished. At least 6 major incidents in the past 2 years. Probably more minor ones I didn't think to track. Martha, that's not coincidence. That's systematic behavior. But what's the purpose? What does she gain? Control, attention, sympathy, or, Sarah paused, she could be ensuring that you don't receive proper medical care. That possibility hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean? If medical personnel are distracted treating her emergency, they're not focusing on properly diagnosing or treating your actual symptoms. It's a form of medical sabotage. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my coffee cup, trying to process this idea. Was it possible that Vanessa's dramatic collapses weren't just about stealing attention, but about preventing me from getting proper medical care? And if so, why would she want to do that? I decided to do some investigating. I called the 3 hospitals where I'd been treated in the past year, claiming I needed to update my insurance information. What I discovered made my hands shake. At Mercy Hospital, where I'd been treated for my dizzy spell yesterday, there was no record of Vanessa ever being a patient. Despite being transported there by ambulance and treated for hours, she'd somehow never been officially admitted. At St. Joseph's, where we'd gone after my car accident, the same thing. No record of Vanessa as a patient, even though I clearly remembered her being treated for her fainting episode. At General Hospital, where I'd had my gallbladder surgery, they had a record of Vanessa being treated in the ER for a panic attack, but she'd given a different last name and different insurance information. This wasn't just attention-seeking behavior. This was fraud. But why commit medical fraud just to steal attention from your mother-in-law? What was the real purpose? That afternoon, I went shopping for what I call my power outfit, a crisp navy blazer that made me look like I could still run the world. Because I had a feeling I was going to need all the authority I could muster. At dinner, wearing my new armor, I decided to conduct a little experiment. I've been having some concerning symptoms lately, I announced, cutting my pot roast with deliberate precision. Vanessa's fork stopped mid-bite, like someone had hit her pause button. What kind of symptoms? Oh, probably nothing. Just some dizziness, a little nausea. You know, the usual complaints of someone whose body is apparently staging a revolt. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Vanessa set down her fork, her hand fluttering to her chest like a dying butterfly. "That's so weird," she said, her voice suddenly breathless. "I've been feeling dizzy too. All afternoon, actually." Bingo. I nearly choked on my pot roast. Really? How coincidental. Here I am, describing possible health issues, and you're suddenly experiencing the exact same thing. Maybe it's something in the air, she suggested weakly. Yes, that must be it. The mysterious dizzy air that only affects people when someone else mentions symptoms. Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was heading. "Martha, maybe you should see Dr. Patterson about these episodes." "Already made an appointment," I lied, smoother than butter on warm toast. "Tomorrow morning, bright and early." I watched Vanessa's face carefully. For just a moment, panic flickered across her features before she composed herself. "That's good," she said. "You should definitely get checked out." "I think so too. In fact, I'm going to ask Dr. Patterson to run a complete blood panel. Really thorough testing this time." Now Richard looked uncomfortable too. "Don't you think that's overkill? You probably just need to drink more water." "Better safe than sorry," I replied cheerfully. "At my age, you can't be too careful about unexplained symptoms." The rest of dinner passed in tense silence. When Vanessa excused herself for what she claimed was a bathroom break but turned into a 20-minute absence, I knew something was brewing. I found her in the hallway, whispering into her phone like she was coordinating a military operation. "She's asking questions," I heard her say, "about the symptoms." "No, I handled it, but we need to be careful. What if she actually goes to the doctor?" When she saw me, she hung up faster than a telemarketer who'd called during dinner. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I asked, with my sweetest grandmother smile. "Fine," she replied, but her laugh sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Just checking on my mother." "How lovely. I hope her sudden emergency is resolving well." "Emergency?" "Well, you were gone for 20 minutes having what sounded like a very urgent consultation. Unless your mother has developed the miraculous ability to treat dizziness through telephone therapy." Vanessa's face turned an interesting shade of pink. "She's fine. Just needed someone to talk to." "How wonderful. There's nothing quite like a good heart-to-heart conversation. Speaking of hearts, I should probably get some rest. Big day tomorrow with the doctor and all." That night, I lay in bed thinking about that phone call. We need to be careful. What if she actually goes to the doctor? We? Who was we? And why would they be worried about me seeing a doctor for dizzy spells? I was starting to suspect this went much deeper than simple attention-seeking behavior. There was something they were afraid I might discover. Something they'd been working very hard to keep hidden. But what? I thought about all the symptoms I'd been having lately. The dizziness, the nausea, the fatigue, the way I felt better on days when I wasn't home much. The way Richard had been so attentive about my medications lately, always making sure I took them on schedule. My medications. I got up and went to my bathroom, turning on the light and really looking at my pill organizer for the first time in months. Everything looked normal, but something nagged at me. When had Richard started organizing my pills for me? I'd been managing my own medications for years, but sometime in the past few months, he'd taken over that task. "To help you remember," he'd said, "so you don't accidentally double dose." But I'd never had trouble remembering to take my medications. I was a retired pharmacy technician, for God's sake. Managing medications was second nature to me. So why had Richard insisted on taking over? And why was I having more symptoms now than I'd had before he started helping? A chill ran down my spine as a horrible possibility began to take shape in my mind. Wednesday morning, instead of going to a doctor's appointment I'd never actually made, I did something that would have made my late husband proud. I started investigating like the stubborn woman he'd married. First, I called every hospital in the area, claiming to be updating my medical records. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Vanessa had been to emergency rooms 17 times in the past 2 years. 17 times. Always with vague symptoms that cleared up quickly. Always when I or another family member had been seeking medical attention. But here's the kicker. She'd used 3 different names and claimed different insurance information each time. That wasn't attention-seeking behavior. That was systematic fraud. Next, I did something I'd never done before. I searched through Richard's computer while he was at work. What I found in his browser history made me sit down hard in his desk chair. Searches for elderly health decline symptoms, natural causes of death in seniors, and most chilling of all, how long does digitalis take to work? Digitalis, heart medication that could be deadly in the wrong doses. My hands shaking, I went to my medicine cabinet and really examined my pills for the first time in months. The blood pressure medication looked right, but when I rolled one between my fingers, something felt different about the texture. I needed help, and I needed it from someone who would believe me without thinking I was a paranoid old woman. I called Maria, the young pharmacist who'd taken over my old position when I retired. "Mrs. Calloway, how are you feeling lately?" "That's actually what I'm calling about. Maria, if someone wanted to slowly make an elderly person sick, hypothetically speaking, what would they use?" There was a long pause. "That's a very specific hypothetical question. Humor me. Something that would cause symptoms like dizziness, nausea, fatigue, but wouldn't show up in routine blood work? Well, there are several options. Digitalis in small doses, certain plant toxins, even everyday substances in the wrong quantities." She paused. "Mrs. Calloway, you're scaring me. Do you think someone is trying to hurt you?" "I'm not sure yet. But if they were, and I brought you some pills to test, could you tell me what was really in them?" "Absolutely. Mrs. Calloway, if you're serious about this, you need to be very careful." "Sweetheart, I've been careful my whole life. It's gotten me this far." That afternoon, I palmed several of my blood pressure pills while Richard was at work, careful to replace them in the organizer so he wouldn't notice any missing. Then I drove to the pharmacy, my heart pounding harder than it had during any of my dizzy spells. Maria took the pills to the back room for testing while I waited, trying to look like a normal customer picking up a prescription instead of a woman who suspected her own family was trying to kill her. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours, but finally she emerged, her face pale as fresh snow. "Mrs. Calloway, these aren't blood pressure medications. They're digitalis compounds, high doses." The world tilted around me, but this time it wasn't from any dizzy spell. This was the earth-shaking realization that my worst fears were true. "What does that mean?" I whispered. "It means someone has been poisoning you, slowly, carefully, but poisoning you nonetheless." I gripped the counter to steady myself. "How long would it take to work?" "Depends on the dosage. Could be weeks, could be months." The symptoms would start mild, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, then gradually worsen until... She couldn't finish the sentence. "Until I had a heart attack that looked completely natural." She nodded. I stood there for a moment, processing this information. Someone in my own family was trying to kill me. Someone who sat at my dinner table, who hugged me goodbye, who called me Mom. And now I understood what Vanessa's dramatic collapses were really about. Every time I showed symptoms of poisoning, she created a medical distraction to make sure no doctor would properly examine me or run the tests that might reveal what was really happening. She wasn't just stealing attention. She was covering up evidence of attempted murder. "Mrs. Calloway, we need to call the police." "Not yet," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "First, I need to figure out exactly who's behind this and gather enough evidence to make sure they can't talk their way out of it." But even as I said it, and as I knew who was behind it. Richard had access to my medications. Richard had been researching digitalis. And Vanessa. Vanessa was making sure that every time I showed symptoms of poisoning, the medical staff would be too distracted to properly diagnose me. They were working together. They were trying to kill me together. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications. How long had this been going on? How close had I come to not figuring it out in time? That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at my pill organizer, trying to decide what to do next. I couldn't just stop taking the fake pills. They'd notice. But I couldn't keep taking them either. I needed help, real help from people who would believe me and know what to do. The next morning, I called Detective Morrison from the Elder Services Unit. I'd met her at a community meeting years ago, and she'd struck me as someone who actually listened to older people instead of just placating them. "Detective Morrison, this is Martha Calloway. I need to report an attempted murder." "Ma'am, are you in immediate danger?" "I've been in danger for months. I just finally figured it out." An hour later, she was sitting in my living room, listening to me explain everything while taking careful notes. I showed her my documentation of Vanessa's medical fraud, Richard's browser history, and most damning of all, the lab results from Maria. "Mrs. Calloway, These are very serious accusations. Do you have any proof beyond the pills? I handed her my notebook documenting every incident. 17 separate occasions where Vanessa had medical emergencies that prevented me from receiving proper care. All while someone was systematically poisoning me. Detective Morrison studied the pattern. This is comprehensive. You've been investigating this yourself for the past week, but I think they're getting suspicious that I'm suspicious. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. It was Vanessa. Martha, I'm so worried about you. Richard told me you've been having more dizzy spells. I think we should take you to see Dr. Patterson today. I met Detective Morrison's eyes, and she nodded, gesturing for me to put the phone on speaker. How thoughtful of you, dear. But I'm feeling much better today. Are you sure? You sounded so confused yesterday. Maybe we should have you checked for dementia. These episodes you've been having. Dementia. Of course. If they could make me seem mentally incompetent, no one would believe me if I tried to expose them. I'll think about it, I said, hanging up. Detective Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Calloway, I believe you, but we need to catch them in the act. Are you willing to help us set up a sting operation? What kind of sting? We'll monitor you closely while you continue to appear to take the fake pills. When they try to escalate, and they will, now that they think you're getting suspicious, we'll be ready. I thought about this. It meant continuing to let myself be poisoned, continuing to pretend I didn't know what was happening. It meant putting my life in even more danger, but it also meant stopping them before they could hurt anyone else. And it meant making sure they couldn't claim it was all a misunderstanding or that I was just a confused old woman imagining things. What do I need to do? The plan was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. I would continue my normal routine while wearing a hidden monitoring device. Detective Morrison's team would be watching my house, and I had a panic button that would bring them running if things went wrong. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would go wrong. Friday morning, Richard seemed agitated as he prepared my breakfast. Instead of the usual 1 pill beside my orange juice, he placed 3. You seem to be having more episodes lately, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Dr. Patterson thinks you should increase your dosage. When did you talk to Dr. Patterson? Yesterday while you were napping. I pretended to take the pills, palming them like a Vegas magician while my heart raced. 3 pills instead of 1. They were trying to finish this quickly. Actually, Richard, I've been thinking about what Vanessa said yesterday. Maybe I should see about getting checked for dementia. His face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? I think that's very wise. Could you call and set up an appointment, maybe for this afternoon? Of course. I'll call right now. As soon as he left the room, I activated the panic button Detective Morrison had given me. But instead of the cavalry arriving, I heard Richard on the phone in the next room. She wants to be evaluated for dementia. Yes, this afternoon if possible. The memory care unit? Perfect. Memory care unit. They weren't just trying to have me declared incompetent. They were trying to get me committed. I needed to get out of the house. But before I could move, I heard Richard's footsteps returning. Good news, he announced, seeming genuinely happy for the first time in weeks. Dr. Patterson can see you this afternoon. They have an opening at the memory care facility. Memory care facility? Just for evaluation, he said quickly. To make sure you're getting the right treatment for your confusion. How thoughtful. And Vanessa will be coming too? She insisted. She's so concerned about you. I'll bet she was. Once they got me committed to a memory care facility, they could control my medical treatment completely. They could increase the poison, prevent me from communicating with the outside world, and make my death look like the tragic but natural decline of an elderly woman with dementia. It was actually brilliant, in a completely psychotic way. What time is the appointment? I asked. 2 o'clock. We should leave here around 1:30. That gave me 4 hours to either escape or spring the trap. 4 hours to decide whether to run or fight. I chose to fight. Richard, I said sweetly, I'm feeling a little anxious about this appointment. Could you make me some tea? That chamomile blend I like? Of course, sweetheart. As soon as he went to the kitchen, I quickly activated my phone and sent a text to Detective Morrison. They're trying to commit me today. 2 p.m. appointment at memory care facility. Need help now. Her response was immediate. Team in position. Stay calm. Follow the plan. What plan? The plan was to catch them escalating their poisoning attempts, not to let them lock me up in a facility where I'd be completely at their mercy. Richard returned with my tea, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he set the cup down. Nervous about something? I asked. Just worried about you, he replied, but he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I pretended to sip the tea while watching him carefully. He seemed to be waiting for something, checking his watch every few minutes. Then I understood. The tea wasn't just tea. They drugged it, probably with something to make me seem confused or disoriented for the appointment. I set the cup down. This tastes bitter. Did you put sugar in it? No sugar. Maybe the tea's old. Maybe. I stood up slowly. I think I'll lie down for a bit before we have to leave. Good idea. Rest will help. But as I walked toward the stairs, the room started spinning again. Not the mild dizziness I'd been experiencing from the poisoned pills, but something much stronger. Whatever they'd put in that tea was working fast. I made it to my bedroom and closed the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the panic button. But before I could press it, I heard voices downstairs. Vanessa had arrived early. Is she drinking it? She asked. She had some, but not all of it, Richard replied. Maybe we should have used more. We can't use more. It has to look natural, remember? Like she's just getting confused and disoriented? I crept to the top of the stairs, staying out of sight, but trying to hear every word. What if she doesn't seem confused enough for the evaluation? Richard asked. Then we'll help her along. I brought some of those pills that make people seem agitated and paranoid. We can give her one in the car. They were planning to drug me into appearing mentally incompetent. Once I was committed, they could control every aspect of my medical care. They could poison me with impunity, and if I tried to tell anyone what was happening, they'd just say it was the dementia talking. I pressed the panic button and waited, but nothing happened. No sirens, no police cars, no rescue team. Either the device wasn't working, or Detective Morrison's team was waiting for more evidence. I was on my own. The room was spinning more violently now, and I could feel my coordination slipping away. Whatever they'd put in that tea was strong enough to kill me if I'd drunk the whole cup. I needed to get out of the house before they came upstairs to check on me and found me conscious and alert instead of drugged and confused. Moving as quietly as possible, I opened my bedroom window. The roof of the back porch was directly below, and if I could make it that far, I could climb down and escape through the backyard. It was a ridiculous plan for a 74-year-old woman, but it was better than letting them succeed in their attempt to have me committed. I was halfway out the window when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Martha? Richard called. How are you feeling? It's almost time to go. I dropped onto the porch roof as quietly as possible, but the impact sent a shock of pain through my arthritic knees. I bit back a cry and crawled toward the edge, where the old oak tree provided a way down to the yard. Martha, Richard's voice was closer now. Martha, where are you? I heard my bedroom door open just as I grabbed the tree branch and swung myself off the roof. For a moment, I hung there like an elderly monkey, wondering if this was how my obituary would read. Woman dies attempting to escape from her own house. But adrenaline is a wonderful thing. I made it to the ground just as I heard Richard shout from my bedroom window. She's not here! Vanessa! She's gone! I ran through my backyard and into the neighbors, not stopping until I reached the street. My phone was still in my pocket, and I called Detective Morrison as I stumbled toward the main road. Martha, where are you? They tried to drug me, I gasped. In the tea. They were going to take me to a memory care facility and have me committed. We're on our way. Where are you now? Corner of Pine and Maple. I climbed out my bedroom window. You did what? It seemed like a good idea at the time. Within minutes, police cars were surrounding my house. I watched from Detective Morrison's vehicle as they arrested Richard and Vanessa, both of whom were still trying to maintain their innocence even as the evidence mounted against them. This is insane, Vanessa shouted as they led her away in handcuffs. She's obviously having a psychotic break. She climbed out a window. Yes, I called back, and it was the smartest thing I've done in months. The interrogation room at the police station was exactly like you see on TV. Bland, uncomfortable, and designed to make people tell the truth whether they wanted to or not. I sat behind the one-way glass, watching Richard try to maintain his innocence while the evidence piled up around him like snow in a blizzard. Mr. Winters, we have your internet search history showing research into digitalis poisoning, Detective Morrison said calmly. We have the fake pills with your fingerprints on the bottle. We have 17 documented instances of medical fraud committed by your accomplice. We have recordings of you discussing Martha's evaluation for dementia. What we don't have is your explanation. I want a lawyer, Richard said for the 5th time. In the next room, Vanessa was telling a very different story. She'd already confessed to the medical fraud, the fake emergencies, and her role in diverting attention from my symptoms. What she was trying to do now was minimize her involvement and throw Richard under the bus completely. He told me it would look natural, she sobbed to her interrogator. He said old people die of heart attacks all the time, and no one would question it. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But you did hurt someone, the detective replied. Mrs. Calloway could have died. That was never the plan. We just wanted her to seem frailer, more dependent, so we could get power of attorney and access to her accounts. And when that wasn't working fast enough, Vanessa's voice dropped to a whisper. Richard said we needed to speed things up. He said the digitalis would make it look like her heart just gave out. But I never thought he'd actually what? Try to have her committed. That was his idea. He said once she was in the memory care facility, we could control everything. Her medications, her medical treatment, her contact with the outside world. I turned away from the window. I'd heard enough. Thomas was waiting for me in the hallway, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what was happening. How could you? They were very good at what they did. But the pattern. All those times Vanessa had emergencies when you needed help. The pattern was only obvious once I knew what to look for. I patted his arm. They fooled everyone, sweetheart. Don't blame yourself for not seeing what they worked so hard to hide. How did you know? What made you finally realize what they were doing? I thought about this carefully. It wasn't any one thing. It was the accumulation of small details that didn't add up. Vanessa's perfectly timed emergencies. Richard's sudden interest in managing my medications. The way I felt better on days when I wasn't home. But what made you test the pills? When I realized they were working together. The phone call I overheard, the way they both pushed for me to see doctors about dementia. It clicked that this wasn't just about attention or even money. This was about control. And ultimately, it was about eliminating the only thing standing between them and my bank account. Detective Morrison emerged from the interrogation room. Mrs. Calloway, they're both confessing. Richard's trying to make a deal, but with the evidence we have, he's not in a position to negotiate. How long will they go away for? Attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy. They're looking at significant prison time, 15 to 20 years, minimum. That night, Thomas stayed over, afraid to leave me alone even though the danger was past. We ordered pizza and sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where this nightmare had started, and talked about everything except what had just happened. But eventually, he asked the question I'd been dreading. What happens now? How do we move forward from this? I looked around my kitchen, thinking about all the mornings I'd sat here taking pills that were designed to kill me, all the meals I'd shared with people who were plotting my death. Now, I said, we remember that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about refusing to let the people who hurt you define who you become. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and every day brought new revelations about the scope of Richard and Vanessa's conspiracy. They'd been planning my murder for over a year, carefully researching methods that would be undetectable and appear natural. The prosecution painted a picture of two people so consumed by greed that they'd been willing to slowly torture an elderly woman to death for her money. The defense tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that they'd been trying to help me manage my declining health. That argument fell apart when they played the recorded phone conversations. She's getting too suspicious. Vanessa's voice filled the courtroom. We need to speed up the timeline. How much more can we give her without it being obvious? Richard replied. Enough to finish the job. And if that doesn't work, we can always use the backup plan. The memory care facility? Once she's committed, we can do whatever we want. Who's going to believe a crazy old woman with dementia? The jury looked horrified. I felt vindicated. On the final day of testimony, I took the stand to give my victim impact statement. Your Honor, for months I lived in my own home while two people I trusted systematically poisoned me and gaslit me into thinking I was losing my mind. They stole my health, my peace of mind, and nearly stole my life. I looked directly at Richard and Vanessa. But here's what they didn't count on. I'm too stubborn to die quietly, too smart to be fooled forever, and too determined to let them win. I paused, letting that sink in. They thought they were clever, but they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated their target, and that mistake is going to cost them the next 20 years of their lives. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Vanessa's quiet crying. I hope they used that time to think about the fact that their greed didn't just nearly destroy my life, it destroyed my son's marriage, broke apart our family, and shattered the trust that should exist between people who claim to love each other. I straightened my shoulders. But most of all, I hope they understand that their failure wasn't just about getting caught. It was about choosing to target someone who refused to be a victim. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard was sentenced to 22 years for attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Vanessa received 18 years for the same charges. Both sentences were to be served without possibility of parole for at least 15 years. As they were led away, Vanessa looked back at me one last time. You can't prove we actually tried to kill you, she said desperately. It could have been an accident. I held up my notebook, the same notebook that had helped convict them. Actually, sweetheart, I proved exactly that. Every dizzy spell, every fake emergency, every lie you told, it's all documented. She looked stunned, like she'd never considered that someone might actually keep track of what they were doing to them. The difference between us, I told her, is that I paid attention, and you didn't. 6 months after the sentencing, I stood in my kitchen making coffee, real coffee, with my own hands, using my own ingredients, taking my own actual medications afterward. Simple pleasures that I would never take for granted again. Thomas had moved in temporarily after the trial, worried about leaving me alone. But today he was packing to move back to his own place. Are you sure you'll be okay here by yourself? He asked for the 100th time. I survived being slowly murdered in this house, I replied. I think I can handle living here peacefully. He laughed, but it was still a little nervous. Have you thought about dating again? Maybe finding someone new? Honey, after what I've been through, I think I'll stick to my own company for a while. It's much safer. Sarah, the nurse Thomas had been dating during the whole ordeal, had become a close friend. She stopped by that afternoon with groceries and updates from the hospital. You know what I admire most about your story? She said, as we prepared dinner together. You never gave up on yourself. Even when they were making you doubt your own mind, you trusted your instincts. The alternative was dying, I replied, and I wasn't ready for that. Are you ready to start really living again? I thought about this question while we cooked. For months, I'd been focused on survival, on catching the people who were trying to kill me, on seeing justice done. But now that it was over, what came next? I think I'm ready to help other people avoid what happened to me, I said finally. That's how the Martha Calloway Foundation for Elder Protection was born. Using the settlement money from Richard's insurance policy and the proceeds from selling the story to a true crime podcast, I'd established a nonprofit dedicated to training healthcare workers, law enforcement, and families to recognize the signs of elder abuse. Detective Morrison had become the director of training, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell served on the board. We'd already helped identify and prosecute 12 cases of elder abuse across 3 states. You know what the best part is? Detective Morrison said during our quarterly board meeting. Every case we solve, every family we help, it's like getting revenge on Richard and Vanessa all over again. I smiled. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's making sure no one else has to go through what you went through. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the sunset, thinking about how much my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been a trusting elderly woman living quietly with her partner. Now I was a nationally recognized expert on elder abuse, a best-selling author, and apparently something of a folk hero to people who'd been underestimated because of their age. My phone rang. It was a woman from Oregon whose symptoms sounded familiar. Mrs. Calloway, I think my son-in-law might be poisoning me. Every time I feel sick, his wife has some kind of emergency that takes all the attention away from me. Tell me everything, I said, pulling out a notebook. And don't worry, we're going to figure this out together. As I listened to her story, I felt that familiar surge of determination. Because Richard and Vanessa had taught me something important. The world is full of predators who target the vulnerable. But they'd also taught me something else. Sometimes the vulnerable fight back. And when they do, they're absolutely ruthless about it. After I hung up, I made one more phone call to Detective Morrison. We've got another one, I said. Oregon this time. Same pattern. I'll make some calls. How soon can you be there? Tomorrow morning, but this time we're not waiting for them to escalate. This time we stop them before they get that far. I hung up and looked around my quiet house, the house where I'd nearly died, and where I'd found the strength to fight back and win. Tomorrow, I'd help another elderly person refuse to be a victim. Next week, I'd give another speech about recognizing the warning signs of elder abuse. Next month, I'd help train another group of healthcare workers to spot the patterns that almost killed me. It wasn't the retirement I'd planned, but it was exactly the life I'd chosen. And as I sat there in my safe, quiet house, alive and free and completely in control of my own destiny, I smiled, because sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to die. And I intended to live a very, very long time indeed. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.